Welcome to my podcast, and I'm sitting in a conference room in an old stable, at the top of an old stable at the back of the castle, and I'm sitting here with Sir Nicholas Kenyon, who at present is running the Barbican, which is an extraordinary centre for music and arts, and in the past was in charge of the Proms at the Royal Albert Hall, 8 weeks of fantastic music. And before that was in charge of BBC Radio 3 and really took it through innovation and creation to the BBC Radio 3 it is today. So welcome, Nick. Thank you so much for coming round today. And it is a bit blustery outside, so thank you for sitting inside. But we have a ready supply of coffee, and it's a joy to see you again because, of course, we haven't met up for a while, given this strange world.
Well, it is a really strange world, isn't it? And for those of us who absolutely live by events that bring people together, it has been a really traumatic time. It's been a particularly traumatic time for those who have not been able to earn money through this period. But it's been an equally traumatic time, I think, for audiences who haven't been able to get the extraordinary fix and excitement that live music and live theatre, restaurants, whatever sort of gatherings you think about, just have not been able to happen. Because that goes against the whole tradition that we have built up over the decades, that what art does is to bring people together. It brings people together to celebrate even when there's a terrific crisis on. And one thing I was reminded of going back as far as the Second World War was the fact that when the war was on and London was subject to the Blitz, that was the time when the National Gallery, even though it had moved all its pictures out to Wales, put on concerts with Myra Hess, the great pianist, curating those concerts, and people would come and risk there being a bomb raid or anything that might have happened for the togetherness that music brought them at that time. So I think what we're up against is a very, very strange situation of not gathering and not coming together.
You would have hopefully had supper with me at the Newbury Spring Festival in May, and that's passed us by as an empty 2 weeks.
Yes, I was going to do a talk on Beethoven.
Oh, you were going to do that? Of course you were.
For his 250th anniversary. So whether Mark Einan, the director of the festival, decides that there's room for a talk on Beethoven for his 251st anniversary remains to be seen.
Well, I think perhaps it's a really good reason to do it. And I don't with you know, but I was then with Mark and the Newbury Spring Festival going to create Mozart in the Gardens in honour of my mother-in-law and the Newbury Spring Festival in June, and playing Mozart's Partita by the Etruscan Temple, which I thought I was so looking forward to. I've rescheduled it to next June, but can you believe we're sailing through 2020 and the nights are drawing in, and I'm now scheduling things for June 2021, which is quite scary, isn't it?
Well, we are having to do exactly the same at the Barbican, because you can imagine the number of events that we had to cancel during these months. And of course, people are desperate to perform. They're desperate to getting back to performing. And so, given that we plan a way in advance anyway, we're now having to shoehorn in events which we've postponed from this year and the events that we already have scheduled for next year. I'm sure you're the same here at the castle. And so it is a big challenge, particularly because you've got to measure the audience appetite, and it's incredibly unpredictable as to where the whole public health situation is, even, dare one say it, by the middle of next year.
Well, Mozart's Partita is going to be in the gardens, and it still can be. And I was also trying to pick up some youngsters from the Royal Academy of Music. So I love welcoming those at the beginning of their career. So they have, well, something I hope on their CV, and it's a delight to pay them. They have been studying for such a long time. So part of what I love to do here is small things like that. And often, I'm not sure, at some of the dinners, I have asked some other youngsters along as well, which I'm not sure whether you've been here or not, but I hope, looking back, Nick, I have so enjoyed the dinners and welcoming you, or the lunches. I'm so glad I've done them. I can't wait to do them again. That is the music of life, isn't it? It's so important.
Yes. And I think just this whole theme of gathering people, whether for meals, for events, for fireworks, for festivities, throughout history, that has been a theme of people's lives. And we've just got to find the right way of bringing that back in. But it's marvellous what you say about young players and young singers. That is such an important thing for the future, because I think a lot of them now this summer have been looking at empty diaries and very much doubt as to whether some of the institutions that they're linked with, particularly the smaller organisations that don't have a lot of funding, can actually survive into the new world. So I think we've got to be very, very supportive of the whole artistic community, because, of course, there are no great artists that emerge without them having been young artists first.
Funny enough, I have a few ideas which I'm going to share with you later, in case you tell me they're a bit silly. But I also think music is such an anchor. And this morning, Nick, to let you into the secret of my mornings, I go biking with the dogs sometimes and then stop in a grassy glade in the garden somewhere. And I have my yoga mat on my back. I put it on the floor. The dogs help me, which I'm not sure they do or don't help me. And I tend increasingly at the moment just to play the Mozarts, the things that the Handels. I go back to the great composers who I remember my parents loving from my childhood. And, when you go back, I know personally that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for those points to help me live forwards again. So I don't know what you're thinking of putting on, but can you give us a glimpse?
As the inheritor of an 18th century house and fantastic estate, that's such a wonderful picture, because, of course, in the past, you might not have had the bicycle, but you would have had your horse, you would have been out on your hunting trip, and you would have had live musicians come and entertain you, maybe up at the temple. I don't know.
Which is what I'm trying to share with visitors next year. And I think we can do that outside, so that's part of it. And it will also raise a bit of money for the Newbury Spring Festival. But it is interesting. So at the Barbican, with next year's programme, is there a theme? How are you looking at that?
We have done a lot of work, because remember that the Barbican, which is this modernist arts centre in the middle of the city of London, it's a remarkable building because it is a housing estate for 4,000 people, as well as being a wonderful arts centre. It isn't just about music. We have theatre, art gallery, cinema, some wonderful open spaces. And what we had to do in reacting to the lockdown was to do a very careful plan of reopening, to which we couldn't immediately attach the dates, because we didn't know what the public health situation was going to be. But just as you've been able to open the house now, we've been able to open the art gallery at the Barbican. We've done that on timed tickets and with social distancing, a single route around the building, and that has worked really well. The fantastic conservatory at the top of the Barbican, which is a green space you really do not expect to find in the middle of the City of London, that's also been open free to the public on booked tickets. So looking forward to music, we have got a plan for the autumn, which is to do a small number of small-scale events in the concert hall, specially designed to be both digital, i.e. able to be streamed, and live, and that hopefully they will have a live audience, albeit spaced out in the hall, but it's going to be a real testing time to see if you can create the same atmosphere with an audience of a third of capacity. And I think that's what a lot of theatres are struggling with at the moment. They're struggling with it both as an experience, but also economically. Is it worth their reopening the West End, for instance, in order to get less than a third of the income that they need in order to survive. And also, one sort of senses there's a fear about what a great popular musical will sound like if there isn't a completely packed audience responding in the way that they have been responding to Hamilton or Phantom of the Opera or whatever.
Yes, I mean, I went to see Hamilton, actually, luckily, before lockdown. So enjoyed it. And George III may have lost the colonies, but he stole the show. He was just such fun. I just enjoyed the energy of it. And again, it's the energy and the inspiration that I think theatre and music give us. So yes, you're right, it is a huge conundrum.
But I do think one thing that has been very interesting during the lockdown is the sheer inventiveness that people have brought to the digital streaming. And there are so many different models if you look around. You know, people have been creating just one-to-one performances, which is wonderful. People have been creating 4 or 5-to-1 performances themselves by re-recording themselves doing 4 or 5 parts of a song or an instrumental piece. And then you've had this whole thing of virtual orchestras and choirs brought together from all over the place individually and mixed together. Now, those are all absolutely fantastic experiences, but somehow I don't feel that they're going to fully replace the live experience when the live experience comes back. I'm sure they will be a complement to it, and I'm sure they will have pushed the whole technique of digital streaming forward, and that's something to be really proud of in this period. But I'm sure that live performance at the end of the day will win the day.
I'm sure it will. And when I go to the theatre, I actually now wish I had to queue at the bar for a drink. And wish I'd bought it in the interval. It's all those small things.
You're tapping into a great British devotion there, which is queuing.
I know.
And of course, back in the days of the proms, queuing was absolutely of the essence because of all the unreserved places that there were for standing in the Albert Hall, and part of the social scene was to queue outside during the day, and many partnerships have been made in those queues, and quite a few of them ended in the queues, I suspect. But, it is a great feature of the British approach to things. I think we are very stoical in that respect. I think the thing we really have to rediscover is the passion. It is the live performance that creates that passion. Now, of course, some experiences are maybe too dense, too busy. You remember all those art gallery exhibitions where you have to peer over people's shoulders to see a Vermeer or a Rembrandt, and spacing that out and making it more disciplined will have a lot to be said for it. But of course, the economics of the situation are that we will all want to get as many people through as we possibly can within the bounds of health and within the bounds of social distancing.
I think you were director of the Royal Albert Hall, the Proms? Or?
I was. The important thing to remember about the BBC and the Proms is we don't run the Albert Hall.
Yes.
We simply rent the Albert Hall and have done for years and years since the war to put on the Proms.
Right.
So I was director of the Proms, but I worked for the BBC rather than for the Albert Hall.
Thank you. And that was for nearly 10 years or so.
12 seasons, yes.
Wow, 12 seasons. I mean, it is. I can't tell you how much I've missed it this summer. You only realise what you take for granted.
It's true.
When it's not there.
Yeah.
And, last autumn I went to a wonderful concert actually around the 11th of November, which I think was to do with SAFA.
All right.
And in the Royal Albert, it was just, which is obviously a military charity, but
yes,
it was just amazing. And that sense of being togetherness and the excitement as you start to hear the orchestra come up and the pleasure of the whole evening. And luckily I can look back on it.
Yes.
But I am worried. I think everybody in the country is probably worried about the future of the Royal Albert Hall because depends, and it's built to hold many people, and how you can go forwards next year in the same way. I'm not quite sure, actually.
The Albert Hall is a very unusual, very special place in the way that it was built, because it was fundamentally funded by people who bought seats in the hall. So it doesn't receive public subsidy. It's not funded by the Arts Council. But there are a large number of seat holders who have to be the owners of the hall. And what you say about togetherness in this context is absolutely right, because it's so different from a conventional concert hall where everybody's sitting in rows and looking forward at a stage. Because it's round, there's no feeling of them and us. It's the orchestra and the audience in one great community. And particularly for the proms, where people may not know abroad, what happens is that you take out all the seats in the centre of the hall, the arena, and people stand there. And those are the cheapest seats in the hall, and they are the best experience and the best sound.
And they're the queue.
Yeah, and they're the queue. So it is an unusual, almost unique experience. And that's what gives the proms, during the years we did them, such an attraction. They've always had that link because of the fact that they are all broadcast, and a lot of them now through the BBC are broadcast abroad into concert series in other countries. And I always remember when one of the most difficult prom seasons we had was in 2001, where the 9/11 attacks in New York happened in the last week of the proms. And therefore we felt, completely reformat the celebrations of the last night of the proms, which are usually uproarious and entertaining, to give them a more sober feel. And we broadcast that concert through the National Public Radio Network in America to most of those stations.
So can I ask you, what did you play on that night? Can you
remember? In the end, what we did was to take out the most uproarious. We played the Negro Spirituals from A Child of Our Time, arranged by Michael Tippett. We played Barber's Adagio, which has become known as one of the great funeral pieces here and in America. And then, because we wanted to capture a spirit of potential optimism for the future, we played the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth with the choral, because we have choral forces there. And that was incredibly moving and really summed up, determination to recover from everything that had hit us. So that was a very good example just of how the proms they're slightly more than a musical event. They are actually a national event.
And did you still end? Because the last night of the proms, for those who haven't been lucky enough to go yet, ends with Auld Lang Syne. So did you still end on that evening with Auld Lang Syne?
Yes, that we still had. And we also, before Auld Lang Syne, after Beethoven 9, we put in Jerusalem, which is, again, one of the great hymns which is sung on the last night, but it certainly acquired a special meaning there on that night.
I think you've just sort of summed up again how much music can lift us up together through times of such trouble and strife, and how I think this particular time of lockdown and locked away has really challenged us as people, and to ask who we are and what we are in comparison to some other of the catastrophes such as World War II, when music and Ensa and all the entertainments, as you've mentioned earlier, brought us together again. But it is fascinating. And I always in awe of my mother-in-law, who began an international music festival, the Newbury Spring Festival here, some 41 years ago. Not easy to start from scratch at all, because music sometimes might seem ephemeral, not entirely necessary, not entirely to do with education, not entirely to do with health. And yet I think it underpins education and health. And you need the music in the schools, the singing together, the choirs. They are again the centre of Christmas again, which I suppose we are going to go towards, aren't we, Nick?
This is a much, much bigger subject, but it's very important to recognise how those music festivals started and how after the war there was a huge, huge rise in the popular appreciation of classical music in particular. And you have the big festivals like Edinburgh and Aldborough, but also festivals like Newbury starting up. And that was allied to the growth of the record industry, where LPs became really much more widely available to people, and radio, where all this stuff was completely free to listen, and an education system which really valued the arts and music. And that's been really under threat in recent years, and I think is something that will have to be recaptured, but is going to be a big, big challenge. So I think the more of us can absolutely put our lives where our convictions are, that music matters and the arts matter, and that for all children it should be an absolute entitlement, an absolute right as they're growing up to be part of this, to encounter music, to take part in it, and that it isn't somehow an ephemeral, nice-to-have activity. That's always been a slightly British problem with the arts, that they're a nice to add on to have if you haven't got anything else particularly important like being an accountant to do, you know?
Oh, well, careful, I am an accountant. Do you know that? I am a chartered accountant.
Well,
and
you're
actually, I'm not a
in
very
that
good
case,
one.
you're a model of what a chartered accountant should be.
But joking apart, if you were taking a younger class to listen to an orchestra, what would be the one piece of music you'd take them to listen to?
Well, there's a challenge. I think one thing we learned at the Proms in putting together concerts for young people is that you have to start from where they are. You have to start from something that they may potentially recognise and then build up from there. So film music, Harry Potter, absolutely great. But what it then led on to was The Storm from Britain's Peter Grimes, absolutely brilliant. The Infernal Dance from Stravinsky's Firebird, absolutely brilliant. Pieces that are short, impactful and vivid in terms of the way they use the orchestra. And kids will respond to that. They don't need any knowledge. They don't need any background. And potentially people are hooked for life.
Did you know how often Malcolm Sargent was a visitor here at Highclere?
No.
He was very much an admirer of Geordie's grandmother, Catherine.
Right.
So he spent quite a few weekends here in the 1930s, mid-1930s.
Yes.
34, 35, 36. So there's a few...
that was before his international career really got going.
So
yes.
I imagine he played the piano which is now in the drawing rooms. It's extraordinary thoughts, actually. And
yes.
There's a few letters I've found in the archives, and Catherine loved music, Geordie's grandmother. So they would meet and go to concerts in London together. Geordie's grandfather preferred the theatre. Right. And then sadly they split up and went different ways. Part of her life in London from 1936 onwards until the Second World War was also going to concerts with Malcolm Sargent, who was so glamorous, so good looking, so dapper. I look at photographs of him. And of course, the other person who was a great friend was the Duke and Duchess of Kent, Princess Marina of Greece, who was also very much part of the set who appreciated all that Malcolm Sargent did and the music in the Royal Albert Hall. And the Duke of Kent was my father-in-law's godfather and used to come here quite a bit. So it's that sort of rather lovely London circle.
Malcolm Sargent was the absolutely key person for the Proms in the 1950s. After the war, he really emerged when the Proms went to the Albert Hall. And one thing that people don't remember is that it was really Malcolm Sargent who created the last night of the Proms in the way it is today for television. And television came on stream during the 1950s, relaying those sort of events. And he was the absolute brilliant master of ceremonies.
He was a brilliant master. He was such an extravagant. He loved, being on the stage as well as being conductor. And I read some very good biographies of him in order to write. I included him as part of two of my books because I was completely fascinated and trying to, again, incorporate music and share the fact that it was the heart of the life at Highclere, and it's the heart of many weekends. Actually, I think that's a new theme for Downton Abbey, isn't it? Julian must write some music into it next time round for the film, if there were to be another film, of course, which we hope there might be. That's tactful, isn't it?
Yeah. And of course, there is still a recording of The Last Night of the Proms in, I think, 1967, where Malcolm Sargent had to give up conducting because he was too ill. Colin Davis was conducting it, but because Malcolm Sargent lived literally next door to the Albert Hall, he came over and came on stage at the end and addressed the audience and said he hoped to be back there the following year, but within a few weeks he had died. So he is one of the great figures.
He was one of the great figures. So it's rather fun to find he had been one of the great figures who came here. But I was wondering, I wanted to ask you, was there something which drew you into the world of music? Was it through the BBC, or was it through music, or what was the driving force, the passion that you found?
There were precisely two things. One was church choir. I was brought up a Catholic and sang as a treble in church choir, and that was what first really ignited my interest. And although I say it myself, I was quite a good boy treble. And that led to the second thing, which was at school singing leading ladies in Gilbert and Sullivan operas. And that was, and you can imagine for a young boy, that was a pretty galvanizing experience. And I've always loved that music, and I still do. And I suppose it's because when my voice broke, it didn't change into anything special or memorable. And so I didn't really go on singing. I think that's why I became interested in doing what I'm doing and making programs for other people to listen to. It was definitely those two things which my parents, not being particularly musical, I think were very puzzled by, but very, very supportive of. And my younger sister became equally interested in music. In fact, she became more interested and became a professional singer. So that was something that we had in common. And I came across just the other day looking for something. My mother took it very, very seriously and started listening to the BBC music appreciation programs and classes and so on, and was still teaching herself the piano, back in her 80s and 90s.
Oh, well, I'm still teaching myself the piano, but I haven't got quite to 80 yet, Nick. So there's clearly hope for me. But I find, because I play it very badly, that playing the piano and playing some old familiar tunes, my mind just goes. It's completely different.
It's very therapeutic.
Wiring. It's very therapeutic. And I just I shut the door and shut myself away. I don't want anybody else there. I don't want the noise of anyone. I just want the piano. At the moment, actually, I'm just working my way through Brideshead Revisited since I live in Downton Abbey. I thought I'd learn the music from something else, which is quite fun. It's a beautiful piece. Anyway, it sort of vaguely amuses me. I always do something contrarian. Yeah. There I'm still doing it.
What we've got in this country is an incredibly fruitful network of things like broadcasting, the record industry, now the digital streaming industry, and live music, which all interact off each other and grow each other. And I think people who say that music can just be a commercial activity and point to, successful musicals and so on. That's all very well, and it is true, but you forget that all the people who are working in those musicals and in the commercial side of the music industry have benefited from the great network of free education, free youth orchestras, which really flourished in previous years. And I think we take that apart at our peril, which is one reason why how everybody now reacts to recovering from the virus is going to have a big, big effect on the years ahead. It's not just a question of getting back to normal. I think it's a question of getting back to a more enlightened way of doing things.
I completely agree with you. And I think having, like many other business, gone through the parts of catastrophe and the sense of falling off a cliff and trying to pull a parachute before we landed very hard. So it was just not too hard, but we were just disaster. And then walking and standing up and putting one foot in front of another, of working out how to carry on, to go forwards, to be there in the future, of how to be innovative and creative. And then it's looking back at what matters a lot. And to my mind, Shakespeare, we have one of the most extraordinary playwrights. His words, his music, his quotes, they're part of our language. So the appreciation of the music, of the concerts, of those extraordinary concert halls around the country, and how they bring us together and how they've brought our parents and our ancestors together in the past, that is hugely valuable. And I'm also an enormous fan of the BBC. I've ended up doing some research to try and understand how it came about, because I find that very interesting in order to understand the journey that it's on now. The World Service is extraordinary and a really important part of it, as of course is Radio 3, which formed part of my childhood and younger life. Now I'm getting so old, because my mother had a great voice, and she only sang in amateur choirs, but she loved singing. And all of our journeys to Cornwall were taken, which were A, 7 hours long, and B, they went along with usually Radio 3, and then my mother singing along where she could do anything as well. It is part of our inner being and spirit, isn't it? So I think this has made us question what it is to be a person.
Related to what you were saying about what made the BBC come to be, it's very important that the BBC was always an adventurous force in music. It did, of course, in the early days, in the 20s, because there wasn't a recording industry at that point. It was the place where you got live music of all kinds. And when you look at some of the BBC programmes of the 1930s in musical terms, they were extraordinarily adventurous. You know, relaying Schoenberg and Berg and Webern and Bartók and Prokofiev, what we would still call some advanced composers, because they believed it was their function to form taste. And that was something we all went on doing with great conviction, because you had to balance the core repertory that everybody knew and everybody valued with works that really pushed the art form forward. And so the role of the BBC in commissioning new music was always a really important thing. And that continues to this day in the proms. And we look at the live proms that are going to happen in the last couple of weeks of this season. They will be live proms without an audience, but they will include exactly that mixture of great masterpieces and unknown works from the present.
We can only do our part, can't we? Play our part.
Yes, and we can only offer what we have to offer to as many people as possible, to the widest possible audience. And in the next few months, and I think years, what we've got to give people the feeling is that this is a really valuable part of their lives, which they need music and the arts and reflection and thought to be part of that life, and that it will be of benefit to everybody. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity.
And I think in the way that you need diversity in nature, you need diversity in your own life as well, don't you? Now, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. I'm going to bear you off for another cup of coffee, and I have got a few ideas, so you can tell me if they're any good or not. But anyway, ideas are good.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Nick, so much. I hope you're enjoying my podcast as much as I'm enjoying making them. Do let your friends and family know about them. Subscribe. And if you're feeling generous, please leave a review. Thank you.